putting them in these pastel colors. They're making them look like these candies that the kids get. Kids are going to see these things around and pick them up and think they're like the sweet tarts or whatever.
For some people, Halloween is anything but a fun time or a fun day. That's because their loved ones were murdered on Halloween.
The Halloween season, it really is a magical time. The costumes, the candy, monster movies in full rotation, but there are also stories of Halloween decorations turning out to be real human bodies, violent crimes, and other truly disturbing events. These are some of the most disturbing things ever to happen on Halloween. The Halloween poisoning case of 1974 is one of the most chilling stories associated with the holiday. Ronald O'Brien, a Texas man, became infamous for poisoning his son Timothy. He'd later become known as the Candyman or the Pixie Sticks Killer. On Halloween night, Ronald gave his son a pixie stick candy filled with cyanide, intending to kill him for a life insurance payout. After trick-or-treating, Timothy ate the candy and tragically died within a couple of hours. Ronald tried to make it seem like a random act of poisoning by claiming that someone in the neighborhood had tampered with the candy, but Ronald had taken out multiple life insurance policies on his son shortly before Timothy's death. This led to his arrest and trial. In 1975, he was convicted and sentenced to death. In 2005, neighbors in Frederica, Delaware were horrified to learn that what they thought was an elaborate Halloween decoration was actually a real dead body. That of a 42-year-old woman who'd taken her own life, hanging herself 15 feet above the ground. People had passed by several times that day and gawked at the sight, thinking it looked eerily real, but didn't report it, figuring it was the Halloween season, after all. Some people get pretty crazy about their decorations. Well, finally, police were called in to investigate, and it turned out this was no decoration. The then wife of the mayor told the local paper, quote, "They thought it was a Halloween decoration. It looked like something somebody would have rigged up." This next case is also extremely disturbing. In late October of 2014, a resident of Farmingdale in Long Island named Dale Silverman was driving home when he spotted something by the side of the road. It looked like a head. This would have immediately set off alarm bells if it weren't the Halloween season. According to Silverman, he thought he was looking at a Halloween decoration. On the other side of the street was a body, which lay on the street for about 20 minutes before a crowd started to gather, tapping it with their feet to see if it was made out of plastic. It wasn't. Pretty soon, cops were swarming the area, and neighbors learned that the body and head had belonged to a woman named Patricia Ward, a beloved member of the community. Her attacker was her very own son, 35-year-old Derek Ward, who removed her head with a blade before carrying her outside and kicking her head across the street. Derek had a history of mental instability and was also apparently addicted to performance-enhancing substances, which may have played a part in the violent outburst. Derek was never apprehended, though, as immediately after taking the life of his mother, he took his own life, jumping in front of a train. The 1991 Halloween blizzard was a powerful storm that hit the upper Midwest of the United States from October 31st to November 4th. As Halloween approached, many areas experienced an abrupt weather shift. The upper Midwest was hit with freezing conditions. On Halloween Day, snow started falling in Minnesota, and by midnight, the Twin Cities had recorded over 8 inches of snow, shattering previous October records. And over the next few days, it just kept coming, with some areas receiving nearly 37 inches of snow. It was the largest single storm total in Minnesota history at that time. The sheer amount of snow and ice caused chaos across the region. Roads were closed, power lines were downed under the weight of the ice, leaving over 100,000 people without electricity for days. Schools and businesses shut down, and in some areas they remained closed long after the storm had passed. And sadly, the storm also took the lives of 22 people. Over 100 others were injured, mainly from car accidents caused by the snow and exposure to the extreme cold. The Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum gas explosion happened on October 31st of 1963. It's one of the most tragic events in Indiana's history. That night, more than 4,000 people were gathered at the Coliseum for a performance of Holiday on Ice. Just after 11, there was an explosion. It had been caused by a leak of liquefied petroleum gas from tanks stored beneath the grandstands. The gas seeped into the area and ignited when it came into contact with an electrical heating element from the concession stand. The explosion killed people seated directly above the gas leak, and the force of the blast sent debris flying everywhere. As people rushed to escape, a second explosion occurred. This was caused by other tanks of gas that had not yet exploded. When first responders arrived, many would say it was the most gruesome sight they'd ever witnessed. Ambulances rushed victims to local hospitals where about 400 were treated for injuries, many of them severe. In the aftermath, a grand jury indicted 7 people, including employees of the gas company and officials responsible for safety regulations. Most charges were dropped or overturned, though. Victims of the explosion received $4.6 million in settlements, but it would never erase the trauma of that night. In 1957, Peter Fabiano, a 35-year-old hairstylist in Los Angeles, was at home with his wife Betty when he answered the door to what he thought was a late-night trick-or-treater. Moments later, Betty heard a deep voice followed by a loud bang. Rushing downstairs, she found Peter dying on the floor. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The case was immediately strange. There were no signs of a robbery, and the only witness was a young man who saw a car speeding away from the scene. So what had happened? Well, the investigation unfolded and it revealed a complicated web of relationships, particularly between Peter, Betty, and a woman named Joan Rabel. Joan had become close friends with Betty, even living together when Betty was considering leaving Peter because of marital issues. Well, Betty and Peter would reconcile, and Joan felt betrayed and angry. She seduced another woman, Goldine Pizer, convincing her to kill Peter. Goldine bought a firearm and waited outside the Fabiano home on Halloween night wearing a mask. After the killing, she disposed of the weapon in a storage locker. 2 weeks later, detectives traced the weapon to Goldine and arrested her. Both women faced trial, with Goldine claiming she had been easily influenced, which was absolutely true. They ultimately pleaded guilty, though, receiving sentences of 5 years to life. In Chicago on Halloween night of 2011, a man named Ledell Peoples took the life of his girlfriend in a heated altercation over a bag of candy. Apparently, he really wanted a Tootsie Roll, but unable to find his bag of goodies, accused his girlfriend Maria Adams of having taken it. The two got into an argument, which turned violent. During the struggle, a plate was thrown before Ledell pulled out a blade and attacked Maria with it. She died of her injuries days later. He was first arrested with a $2 million bond, but after Maria Adams died, his charges were upgraded. This is Eric Matthew Copple, a man currently serving life in prison after taking the lives of 2 women on Halloween night in Napa, California, 2004. Leslie Mazzara and Adrienne Sogna, both 26, were celebrating Halloween with their friend Laura Minza by handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. As the night wound down, though, the 3 women went to bed around 11 p.m., unaware that a horrifying event was about to take place. Later that night, Lauren suddenly woke up to screams coming from upstairs. In a panic, she ran out of the house and drove away. She contacted authorities, who arrived at the home to find Leslie and Adrienne dead in their bedrooms. Eric Matthew Copple later turned himself into police and confessed to the killings, but till this day, he's never revealed his motive. All he's done is apologize to the families in court, saying he'd been suffering from depression and addiction in the months leading up to the attacks, which really doesn't tell you a whole lot. The only connection between him and the woman was that his wife had been friends with Adrienne Insogna, but as for what that has to do with the case, if anything, that's still a mystery. Copple was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shirley Lynette Ledford was killed on October 31st of 1979. She was the final victim of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the Toolbox Killers. The Toolbox Killer case is one of the most disturbing stories in criminal history. In 1979, Roy Norris and Lawrence Bittaker picked up a young woman named Shirley Ledford, who was hitchhiking home from this party. Bittaker and Norris had been targeting female hitchhikers for months, abducting them and subjecting them to unimaginable torment using tools commonly found in a toolbox. After picking up Shirley, they took her to a remote location where they inflicted serious harm on her before taking her life. They then callously discarded her body on a stranger's lawn. She was their 5th victim. About a month later, Roy Norris reconnected with a former inmate, Joseph Jackson, who he started telling all about the gruesome acts he and Bittaker had been committing. Alarmed by what he was hearing, Jackson consulted with his attorney, and ultimately they decided to report the confessions to the police. This eventually led to the pair's arrest. Bittaker died on death row in 2019, and Norris died in prison in 2020. Pictured here is Rodney Pierce, a complete and utter idiot who should absolutely be in prison right now, but he isn't. In fact, he never received any time. This is one of the most infuriating cases I've ever read about for this channel. So in 1992, Yoshihiro Hattori, a Japanese exchange student, was on his way to a Halloween party in New Orleans. Unfortunately, he wasn't familiar with the area and he was having trouble finding the right house. After wandering around, he finally thought he found the party location. He knocked on the door, but when no one answered, he turned to walk back to his car. At that moment, the door opened, and Yoshihiro announced, "We are here for the party," and that's when the homeowner, Rodney, fired at him. Obviously, he'd been at the wrong address. When police arrived, Rodney explained that he thought Hattori was trespassing on his property. He invoked the Castle Doctrine, which allows homeowners to use force to protect themselves from perceived threats, and he was ultimately found not guilty by a jury. Utter nonsense. You get a knock on your door, you don't know the person, so you know what? Better just kill them. And Hattori was actually walking back to his car. It's not like he was standing on the porch with a baseball bat. Couldn't even just, pull out the firearm, give a warning or something. It's just absolutely insane. I can't even believe this one. Anyway, happy Halloween, I guess, everyone. Please be safe out there. And with all that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.